I think in the spirit of time, we'll now go back to our original first speaker, Dr. Sean Darling-Hammond, who was navigating his GPS to arrive here with a lot of big data in GPS, right? So it's wonderful to have him. And Sean will be discussing two major projects that he has been involved in, particularly assimilating data from middle schools. As you look at his slides, it's going to be interesting to see how policy questions are related to big data analysis and how Sean is actually tackling them. So, Sean, the floor is yours. Thank you and welcome.
Hi, how are you? Good. All right. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about how we can harness big data to enhance educational opportunity, particularly for middle school students. But before I begin talking about my research, it's probably worthwhile to say, who is this person that you're going to have to spend the next few minutes listening to? So this is a slice of who I am. I am primarily a husband and dad with two very, very active boys. You can see them lined up there in that little collage. My background is a little odd, so I have a sociology BA and a JD, but also a PhD in public policy, and most of the skills that I leverage in my big data analysis come from PhD studies. I try to bridge departmental silos, keyword try. It's a big ask, but I think it's important to try. In health, education, psych, and law and policy, so you'll see in my work sort of a bridging of understanding the legal and regulatory frameworks that drive what schools do, and then utilizing that understanding to then understand the kinds of practices that impact student health, right? Or student mental health, which is a psychological component. And I generally utilize three groups of methods: in-depth interviews, which you'll hear nothing of today because it's about big data, RCTs, and then econometric and quantitative methods, which is what you'll primarily hear about today. Just in the spirit of making this interesting, what makes me weird is that I've been on NBC's American Ninja Warrior 7 times. I am now retired fully from the ninja life. I am now fully a nerd. And I lived in Japan and speak Japanese. So if anybody also speaks Japanese and wants to help me brush up on mine after this presentation, I would greatly appreciate it. So I'll be talking about two quanti projects. One is called The Dynamic Nature of Student Discipline and Discipline Disparities. Just came out last Monday in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And we're putting it together in manuscript in Big Data and Society. And what I'm going to be doing on that project is both talking about how we can leverage big data, understand what's happening in schools, and how that might inform the policies that we can utilize to improve conditions, but also how we tell stories about the data that we have from these big data sets, which often can become inscrutable to lay people as we start to dig deeper into them and use these very advanced econometric and biostatistical analyses or analytic methods. The second project is on the effects of student exposure to restorative practices. It's going to show up in a number of places, hopefully, and will definitely show up in some places, definitely. But the goal of that work is to understand the causal impact of restorative practices, which are school-based practices that help students who've made mistakes make amends. So let's dive in here. First project, as I mentioned, is the dynamic nature of student discipline and discipline disparities. And that project is designed to eschew what could be called the static view. So when we think about discipline and discipline disparities, we typically think of end-of-year totals. In this school, 2% of Black students were disciplined at some point in the year, and 1% of white students were disciplined at some point in the year, and so the discipline gap is 1%, or 0.01 as a proportion. But those end-of-year totals hide or obfuscate some really critical information that could drive timing of interventions or targeting resources to specific schools. So we took atypically granular daily data from over 45,000 students in 61 middle schools in one of the largest districts in the country, and we tracked the daily discipline rate, disaggregated by racial groups, across this entire district. Then, of course, we sliced the data a million different ways to make sure that what we were seeing was signal, not noise. But what we found was, in the early part of the year, we see this rapid growth in daily discipline for all students, regardless of their positionality, their identity. But for Black students, that growth is much faster, which means that we have a growth in the disparity in daily discipline rates early in the year. What does that mean for policy? That means if you're trying to plan when you're going to do professional development for teachers to ensure that they're more equitable, you need to start early. You start in the winter break and you're way too late. It's already happened. These disparities have already emerged and they're probably ossified at that point. So summer makes a lot more sense for the timing of a professional development. But we also found that just the first 10 or 20 days of the school year provide sufficient information about where disparities will emerge to predict end-of-year totals. If this escalation is happening that quickly, that makes sense, right? A static view would have eschewed that or would have obfuscated that. So now we're going to think about how we can target resources by utilizing earlier data to figure out where disparities are likely to emerge, right? But all of this is kind of hard to understand if you're not a data-y person, this notion of longitudinal data at the student level being utilized to get a sense of sort of aggregate county or district level trends. So we tried to take our data and make it scrutable, make it palatable, make it impactful by translating our data into sound. So here's a little 2-minute clip of what we put together.
What does it feel like to be a Black middle school student? Does the experience change if you're disciplined, or if your school grows more punitive towards Black students over time? This sound represents the Black discipline rate. When it's faster, the discipline rate is higher. Here's what the Black discipline rate sounds like from the beginning of the year through Thanksgiving break. Each beep you're about to hear represents 20 Black students being sent to the principal's office, suspended, or even expelled. By November, the Black discipline rate is 10 times higher than what it was at the beginning of the year and 50 times higher than the white discipline rate at the beginning of the year. One can't help but wonder how that growing inequity impacts the extent to which Black students feel valued and whether it makes them feel like they don't belong at all.
So a little heavy, I apologize, but I think it's important to make these kinds of data stories come to life. If you just hear the stats that I gave or see that figure, you don't feel what it's like to be a Black student, come into school, feel like things are equal, and then within just a few weeks, experience this palatable and potent inequity, which shifts your experience of school, not maybe just for that term, but forever. Suddenly you wonder if you always have to look over your back or look over your shoulder to see if you're going to be treated differently. How does that change your psychology, your stress response? How does that change the extent to which you want to apply yourself in your studies? Now that we have some sense of the timing of this, we can intervene and hopefully avoid that kind of escalation. So that's one data project. Another data project that is kind of in the realm of big data and ed is about the effect of student exposure to restorative practices. So we don't have phenomenal data on what schools are actually doing, what students are being exposed to in terms of school practices. But we do have a lot of cross-sectional data that gives a sense of what students feel teachers are doing. The California Healthy Kids Survey data system, for example, asks students in hundreds of schools throughout the state, to what extent do you feel your teachers are helping you resolve conflicts with your peers? That is a core practice within the milieu of what are called restorative practices, practices that are designed to help students repair relationships when mistakes have been made. Can we use that data to get a sense of what schools are doing, and not only what they're doing in one year, but what they're doing over time, so we can see how school practices are changing over time? That was the goal of this project, was to look at these individual student slices of data within a school, track the extent to which a school is using restorative practices, then track how schools change in their use of these practices, and tie those changes in practices to changes in student experiences. So what we did initially was create a longitudinal data set of school practices, primarily focusing on restorative practices. We then merged that with California administrative data that follows students year after year and tracks the extent to which they've been disciplined and their performance on smarter balance tests, which are sort of tested English language arts and math knowledge. And what we wanted to see was when a student goes from 5th to 6th grade and they suddenly have this big jump or drop in their exposure to restorative practices, do they experience a concomitant growth in their academic performance as predicted by a glut of theory? Do they experience a concomitant drop in their exposure to discipline? And if we look at this at the school level, do schools that increase their utilization of these practices also see aggregate school-wide student mental health improve, student exposure to discipline go down, student academic performance improve? So what did we find? By merging this data, wrangling these millions of data points, and creating these two longitudinal data systems and bringing them together, well, first, we found that kind of as expected, when students see a net increase in their exposure to restorative practices as they go from 5th to 6th grade, they do indeed see their ELA and math scores, or English language arts and math scores, improve. And these are change on change models. So what we're tracking is a student's change in outcome as a function of their change in exposure. So they are net of all student-specific or time invariant endogeneity. That's phenomenal because one of the huge confounding problems we have with big data is maybe we can track people over time, but how can we be sure that what we're seeing is a function of what they're being exposed to rather than who they are? This nets out all that who they are stuff. And the only thing we're now worried about is time variant endogeneity, and not as big of a concern for these kinds of models. We also see that, as expected, as students get more exposure to restorative practices over time, their risk of being disciplined also goes down. So their weather discipline rate goes down and their days of discipline go down. And given a huge range of research demonstrating the psychological ramifications of being disciplined even once, the extent to which that's tied to eventual incarceration, these are important findings. I'll close with just this last little chart, which is what happens as schools grow more restorative over time. You see less school-wide misbehavior, less school-wide gang membership, less victimization, less depressive symptomology, less substance abuse, increased GPA, and increased school climate. All of which would be completely impossible to see if we hadn't wrangled this data in a way that allowed us to do these school change models. So I hope this is a story not just about how valuable data can be to figure out what's going on, but how we need to utilize that data in ways that tell us what we can do with that information. Thank you.